These are the crossed arcs that almost made me put the book down. Today, we're dissecting two extreme horror stories so appalling, you'll wish you just stayed home and watched the Captain Underpants movie instead. We've seen the crossed, but never quite like this. So join me, and together we'll discover what might be the strangest experiment in the entire series. The so-called anti-crossed. Hey guys, I'm your host, Juan. Back at it again for another spooky crossed caper for you absolute maniacs. Today we're covering some of the worst crossed arcs in terms of quality. I feel like I protected you guys from the true worst of the worst so far, but today we're opening a special investigation. We're going to find out just why crossed has some of the reputation it does. And yes, you will be confused and things won't make sense. It's not going to be just you, okay? That's right. Today we're looking at Crossed, Volume 16. There's actually two different story arcs, both written by Bemis, who also happens to be a musician, by the way. Anyway, the first story is called Shrink, and it features art done by Fernando Melek. But before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel in order to stay in the loop with all the latest videos. Also, if you like what I do here, consider signing up for my channel's membership program here on YouTube. There are some mouth-watering, epic perks. But, yeah, I think that about covers all our bases. Let's jump right in. Our story opens on a young boy named Jack having a quiet dinner with his mother. She made casserole, and it's not very good, but Jack pretends otherwise. She's a single mom, trying her best, and Jack is desperate to be as agreeable as possible. Even the very idea of someone disliking him deeply unsettles him. However, the same cannot be said for his younger brother, Clancy, who crudely asks Jack how long it takes to brush the taste of their mom's ass out of his mouth. Yo, why does little bro look like Chucky if he had a vape addiction? Anyway, the two boys grew up, and over the years their personalities crystallized into perfect opposites of each other. Jack became a straight-laced 4.0 GPA, mild-mannered nerd, and Clancy? Well, his Totino's pizza roll ass caught 3 arrests and a school expulsion, all before the age of 15. And to top it all off, after putting his poor mom through hell, Clancy told his weeping mother to eat a dick on his 18th birthday as he walked out the front door without so much as a goodbye. But Jack was still in college at this time. He's 3 years older than his brother, you see. Jack wound up getting a degree in psychology, and rumor has it, his thesis was the one that invented the term love bombing. In any case, it's been 6 years since Jack had seen Clancy, but one day he gets a Facebook message from him announcing that he's going to be in town soon and is planning to drop by. But later that same day, Jack was even more shocked to watch emergency news broadcasts about an infection turning people into hyper-violent serial killer rapists. But all that was 2 weeks ago, and now we're in the present, in a sleepy, normal-looking neighborhood. By the looks of it, you would have no idea that they're in the middle of a worldwide apocalypse. Anyway, Jack lives here, and he hands a cup of coffee to a young woman who thanks him for letting her stay in his house. Her name is Tiffany, and apparently she was wandering around the woods and stumbled upon this town. And so the two of them set out on the porch and casually waved to the passing neighbors walking by. The neighborhood has had 0 contact with the crossed, so they're kind of just chilling. The official explanation is that the town is very remote, but whatever, man. In any event, Jack mentions that he hasn't heard anything from his mom since this all began, and when Tiffany asks if he's got anyone else, he vaguely mentions his brother. But then the scene abruptly cuts to 4 days later for some reason. Living with a girl is making Jack go crazy, and he's about ready to flop out a schmeat and change his dating status. But he gets interrupted by a loud tire squeal outside his window, and then his whole entire house shakes as a red car slams into his garage at breakneck speed. Jack bolts outside and pries open the crumpled car door, only to be shocked by the face smirking back at him. It's Clancy, with a dead cross girl in the passenger seat. Jack is like, what the fuck? And Clancy pulls out a massive blade and threatens to stab him if he doesn't do what he says. And so he forces our protagonist to haul a bunch of chains and locks out of the back of his trunk, and he next orders Jack to clear out a room for him. Clancy steps inside and finally discloses his true intentions. The younger brother confesses that he's a perennial fuck-up who's wasted his life drinking and injecting. But Jack's always been the one who had potential. And so Clancy announces that he wants to do one thing right in his life and help his brother find a way out of the apocalypse. He orders Jack to chain him up because he's about to be the psychologist's first patient. The plan is for Jack to learn what goes on in the mind of the crossed and to see if he can find anything that can help humanity survive. Jack asks Clancy what the hell he's talking about, and he points out that his brother is clearly not infected. But Clancy chuckles and reveals that he carefully carved a piece off of that dead cross girl in the car earlier. Jack begs his brother to stop, but Clancy ignores him and gobbles up the girl's ear with a mischievous grin. Clancy's face instantly begins to contort as the infamous rash burns into his skull, leaving Jack no choice but to slam the door shut and work on tightly locking it down with the metal chains as quickly as possible. Jack immediately brings Tiffany in on all of this, and she's surprisingly cool about the whole thing for some reason. Jack's pretty disturbed, though. There hasn't been a single sound from behind the door since he's locked it, and not only is silence unheard of from the crossed, it's also unprecedented in regard to his notoriously vulgar brother. So, the two decide to go outside and come back later. They casually stroll around the neighborhood, chatting, and the endorphin rush reminds Jack how good it feels to be around a woman. He's also quite fascinated with Tiffany's warm and soothing nature, despite the fact that she had personally witnessed her entire family being slaughtered in front of her just a mere few weeks ago. Anyway, they return back home, and Jack tells the woman to go ahead and sleep, and he'll keep watch over Clancy's door. Tiffany calls him a sweetheart and pecks him on the cheek. Jack's heart swells with satisfaction, and he goes back to trying to communicate with his brother. It goes nowhere at first, and he pounds the door, frustrated at the lack of response. But then, out of the depths, a coarse laugh grows, and a heavy weight presses against the other side of the door. It's the crossed Clancy, and he growls that they're finally alone. Jack, startled, asks if that means he was waiting for Tiffany to leave, but that question is left unanswered. Instead, Clancy spouts out a bunch of vile shit, way too appalling for me to repeat. After talking at length about how he's going to violate his brother, Clancy suddenly stops, and bluntly tells Jack that he wants to kill him. Jack is completely flabbergasted, and he shakily wipes the sweat off his brow. But then a thought comes over him, and he puts on a determined face and drags a chair in front of the locked door. He adjusts his glasses and methodically pulls out a pen and paper, and he asks Clancy how long he's felt this way. Right, so that brings us now to the second issue, which opens with Clancy throwing up in a flashback from like a week ago. He's drinking the day away with a random biker guy at an abandoned bar. The guy apologizes to Clancy for being too drunk to listen to what the redhead was talking about, and Clancy scratches his head and remembers he was talking about his older brother, and that ends the flashback. We pick back up with the therapy session, which is pretty much as unproductive as you would think. Jack asks Clancy how he's feeling, and the ruffian swiftly responds that he's feeling hard. The psychologist brushes this off, and inquires if he's perhaps feeling nauseous. But Clancy just starts ranting about how he wants to rape and eat him. Jack points out that doing all those horrible things won't actually alleviate the underlying drive, and he's in turn told to go fuck himself. So our protagonist tries one last time to get a serious answer out of his subject by asking if he feels any pain in his condition. But Clancy only responds by rambling about how whacking his meat raw feels good, and then he starts pissing everywhere. So Jack calls it quits and goes to the bathroom to wash his exhausted face. Obviously, this shit's turning out to be a worse experiment than the French Revolution's HR department, but nevertheless, Jack contents himself by trying to intellectualize the matter. He figures that the cross virus unleashes the dark unconscious, and so, in a deep, twisted way, whatever reaction or insult the monster throws at him, it must be grounded in who his brother once was. At least in some faint capacity. The material's gotta be coming from somewhere, in other words. Whatever the case, Jack exits and finds Tiffany hovering next to the locked door with her arms crossed. Jack immediately, profusely apologizes for whatever heinous shit Clancy just said to her, but she responds that actually, he hasn't made a single sound. Jack is dumbfounded, and he starts pounding on the door, and we see Clancy standing silently on the inside, gouging out his eye with his thumb. They don't know about that on the outside, though, and Tiffany pipes up that maybe Jack's therapy is helping him. Jack looks at her, then at the door, and is like, nah. But Tiff is serious. She shares that the only way she's been able to cope with her family's murders is with the hope that the crossed can evolve. She specifies that, after all, humans once were uncivilized, primitive monkey savages, and we grew out of that, so why not the crossed? But Jack shakes his head and clasps her hand like a child, lecturing her that no, there's no hope. Wow, this guy's kind of a Redditor. We next get a one-page sequence of that biker guy from earlier stumbling around the woods naked. Crossed, of course. Yeah, this scene doesn't really make sense where it is, and it's definitely something I would have rearranged if I wasn't trying to showcase the story without my usual editorial interference. Anyway, so Jack sits out on the porch as the sun rises, sipping his joe and slipping into another flashback. Also, is it just me or is Blood totally wearing a dress right now? In any event, we're transported back to Jack's adolescence, to a formative moment when he musters up the courage to awkwardly ask the girl he's next to go to the dance with him. She quickly friend-zones him, and he's like, I know you said that before, but I think if you gave me a chance, I can totally rock your world, babe. However, this gallantry is interrupted by Clancy, who has his tongue on the window like a dog. Jack rolls it down and asks what the fuck he's doing, and the menace jams his head in the car and loudly shouts at the girl, "Yeah, I heard you let Hart Mackins eat you out a few times a week." The girl blushes and slightly giggles, and Clancy's like, "Yeah, my brother has a small toddler dick anyway, though." Naturally, Jack was pretty pissed off about all this, and he told their mom everything, and she reamed Clancy for embarrassing his brother like that. She yelled at him that there was only one man in the house, and he actually cared about people's feelings. Clancy's like, yo, this shit's fucking gay. And he stomped off to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. Right. So back in the present, Jack storms back upstairs with a grim look. He was the big brother after all, and doesn't he bear some responsibility for how Clancy ultimately turned out? It's uncertain, but Jack's resolved to get to the bottom of their relationship. So he gets all properly seated, and quietly asks through the door if he was a good brother to Clancy as a child. He doesn't get a direct answer. Instead, the maniac gleefully laughs and mockingly asks Jack if he can guess what he's about to do with his finger. The psychologist's eyes shoot wide in alarm as Clancy pulls down his pants and begins to moan. But right then, Tiffany pops her head around the corner, and the freak goes dead silent. She asks if everything's alright, and Jack angrily slams his stuff into the floor, declaring that he's done with this bullshit. Tiffany softly requests that she be given a shot at it, but Jack's like no. But she presses on anyway, and in a sympathetic voice, she purrs to Clancy, cooing that she knows he's suffering in there, but it's okay. They're not gonna go anywhere. Jack grabs her arm, demanding that she cease this weird delusion, but Tiffany snaps at him to get his greasy paws off of her. She accuses Jack of abandoning his brother, for being a cynic, and not wanting to believe he can get better. Tiffany tells him that he needs to take a long, hard look in the mirror, and so she moodily struts off, leaving Jack speechless. He still jerked off to her later, though, but this time with a hint of anger. Clearly, the Crossed are smarter than they're given credit for, 'cause obviously, his brother is manipulating Tiffany into turning against him. Be that as it may, we return to the woods, where the inexplicably well-groomed infected guy is still waltzing around like an idiot. But I guess his efforts paid off, cause he staggers his way right to the edge of town, and he lets out a victorious roar. Yeah, whatever, man. We return to the house, where Tiffany is seated, monologuing at Clancy's shackled door. She explains that she used to see empathy as inherently feminine, and femininity as inherently weak, and so she built a hard wall around herself. But now she realizes she was wrong. Empathy is what makes us human. Tiffany thinks back to the death of her family at the hands of the Crossed, how they tore them apart and how helplessly it made her feel. How, in an instant, all her shields and defenses immediately collapsed. And now all Tiffany wants is that empathy. She's so desperate to be seen and to be understood. And so she's actually struck by Clancy's silence. It's a little validating to her, because for once, it means someone is listening. Tiffany tells the man that she knows he's not a monster, but we're treated to a full splash page of Clancy leering with several severed fingers jammed up his ass. God damn it. I'm gonna need some therapy after this. Right, as it were, we do another flashback. This time when Jack tried to tell his brother he got into college. Clancy was totally uninterested, and he kept playing his video games without even slightly pretending to care. Jack continues on, though. He bows his head and mentions that he knows they have become distant since they were little, and he apologizes for that. And if Clancy ever needs someone to talk to, his big brother will always be one call away. But the redhead continues to play without regard, though, and Jack, slightly losing his temper, plants his hand on Clancy's shoulder, demanding to know why he won't acknowledge him. Clancy recoils and crushes Jack's hand with a look of pure hatred. He coldly tells Jack never to come into his room without asking. The two brothers silently look at each other, and Jack slumps his shoulders and leaves. Anyway, in the present, we catch up with that naked cross guy, who's fucking around like a degenerate on a large baseball field that this minuscule town in the middle of nowhere has for some reason. And huddled together, watching all this from a distance, is Jack, Tiffany, and their worried neighbor. The guy is freaking the fuck out because their community's been breached, and there's probably more of them close behind. But Jack pushes up his glasses and replies that that's unlikely because they would have heard them by now. He thinks it's just one lone cross guy. So he tells his neighbor that, quote, "There's only one sensible thing to do in this situation," which apparently means completely ignoring the infected guy and locking themselves up in their homes and boarding up all the windows and exits. Hopefully there's not a house fire, I guess. Jack decides to pop open a bottle of tequila to take the edge off. He doesn't really drink, but he's had it for a while and what the hell. So he starts slurping that shit down and he stumbles to his therapy chair to begin another session. He asks Clancy what his dreams are like, and the brute responds by talking about how he wants to skull fuck Jack. Not like fuck his skull, but fuck him with a skull. Charming. Jack scoffs and begins to mock his brother, taunting him that he'll never be able to do any of that. He asserts that Clancy is powerless. He's just a useless piece of shit who spouts perverted nonsense for attention. And the worst part of it all? Clancy was like this before he became infected. But Clancy is unperturbed by this outburst. He just laughs and starts peeing again. So Jack crashes out again and starts hurling shit around in a rage. And the alcohol must have really gone to his head, because he gets the bright idea to break out of his own home and aimlessly wander around the darkened streets. He winds up tripping over a dead body and knocking himself out on a dumpster. What a hero. Jack wakes up a few hours later. It's still dark, but the bright moon illuminates the town, and it's pretty clear everything's gone to shit. He spots his neighbor running past the alleyway, wheezing. I don't know what happened to his shirt, but he kind of looks like that one alligator meme. Anyway, he's running for his life from a pack of cross ghouls, but unfortunately, they catch him. And if you know anything about the crossed, you know they show no mercy. They eat the man alive and simultaneously carve through him with a thick blade. The screams are visceral and gut-wrenching. Jack covers his mouth in unbearable horror, and he quietly backs away into the shadows. He creeps back home and carefully slides back inside. While he acknowledges that what just happened to his neighbor was a terrible act of savagery, he can't help where his mind immediately goes next. You see, he can't stop thinking about how this all means he gets to be a knight in shining armor and save Tiffany. He admits to himself that, yes, he's completely inexperienced with women, but if there's one thing he knows that turns them on, it's a goddamn hero. So he puffs out his chest and charges up the stairs, ready to rescue the girl away from this place. But when he turns the corner, he walks in on Tiffany, completely naked, legs spread, flicking the bean, and moaning in front of Clancy's door. Alright, I'm done with this shit. And if that wasn't bad enough, we jump to a random montage of all the times Jack got caught masturbating in his life. By his mom behind the doghouse, at summer camp, and that time he got caught spanking the monkey to his aunt, by his aunt. You know, I didn't want to say this before, but some of this is starting to get way too specific not to be based on a true story. Anyway, Tiffany lets out a shriek and quickly pulls her pants up. Jack about tumbles over in shock, and that mood is only heightened when Clancy chimes in, laughing that she chose him over Jack. Tiffany breathlessly tries to explain that she was only doing it for scientific purposes, but that's obviously stupid, so she gives up halfway through. Jack, meanwhile, clenches his fists and seethes, and he completely breaks down, shutting out and screaming at her for trying to judge him for anything. And then, quivering with rage, he stomps his foot and yells that women are nothing but a bunch of sluts. Tiffany swiftly decks him across the face with a hard left hook, and she also spits in his face and starts to leave. Jack nebbishly apologizes, begging her to stay, but Tiff tears off the boards covering the front door. Weren't those nailed in? Anyway, she takes one look at the hellstorm outside and promptly changes her mind about leaving. Yeah, as you can see, the situation is irredeemably fucked. Jack starts crying, and Tiffany tells him to get his shit together, cause, for better or worse, they're stuck together, and they need to formulate a plan. Jack wipes away the tears, and responds that he thinks he just fell in love with her. Good God. So of course we do another flashback to Jack and his mother on his graduation day. His mom beams with excitement, and she gushes about how proud she is of her son. She expresses her eagerness to have grandkids one day, but the conversation gets interrupted there. Jack gets a phone call from Clancy. Jack asks where the hell he's been and urges him to return home. He tells him that their mom is worried about him, and so is he. Clancy grunts and slowly exhales his cigarette smoke. In a bitter voice, he hisses that one day, the world is going to see Jack for the stunted moron he always was. He calls his brother an insecure loser who desperately tried to be the man of the house because he couldn't bear to release himself from his mom's tit. And the final thing Clancy says before he hangs up is that when the day arrives, when Jack's finally exposed, he'll be there, laughing. Anyway, in the present, the two geniuses put their heads together and come to the breathtaking conclusion that they can either stay here or run. If they could make it to the woods, they might be fine, but the Crossed are camping outside the front door. Jack looks down and actually proposes that he should go outside and distract them and let Tiffany get away unencumbered. He figures that she's already lost everything once and deserves a chance to make it out alive. Tiffany looks at Jack in astonishment, and she comments that if she didn't find him sexually repulsive, she would probably give him a kiss right now. And to this, Jack responds with a pathetically upbeat, "I know," signaling that he took that as a compliment. In any case, Jack tells Tiffany to wait downstairs. If they're going to go through with this plan, he needs to say goodbye to his brother. So he sits down for the last session, ready to reveal his final assessment. He concludes that Clancy made no progress in their time together, and that's not at all surprising. But he doesn't blame his brother for it. He was just acting in accordance with the base human instinct. Pure experience, and no ego and no overthinking. Jack tells Clancy that if anything gets through to him, it should be this. He's always admired his little brother. He lived free and he'll die free. Something Jack never authentically could. Jack then leans toward the door, and he awkwardly thanks Clancy for never saying anything about it to Tiffany. In the dark, Clancy bears a wide, sinister grin, and with blood streaming down his face, he whispers that he was only waiting for the right moment. And with that, Clancy begins to scream so loud his entire body shakes. He pretends to call for their mom, shrieking that Jack put his fingers in his butthole, that he keeps coming into his room at night and doing it in the dark. Clancy then mockingly wails, "Mommy, Mommy, why don't you believe me?" Jack scrambles down the stairs and, tripping over himself, desperately tries to convince Tiffany that his brother is lying. She looks at him quizzically, asking why he's making such a big deal out of the standard Cross nonsense. But then it all clicks for her. Their relationship dynamic, the severed fingers, Jack's reaction, it all makes sense now. She screeches at him to get away from her, and accuses him of taking advantage of his golden boy status to abuse his own brother, knowing that no one would believe Clancy over him. Jack starts hyperventilating, crying that he was just a kid and he didn't know what he was doing. He howls that you can never admit to something like that, and it's not his fault. Tiffany backs up to the front door, screaming at him again to get away, and Jack, punts her outside. Immediately, dozens of glowing, bloodshot eyes lock onto the girl, and as the rancid hands seize every inch of her body, Tiffany bellows out that Jack's a coward and he's gonna burn in hell. But he can't really hear her. All of his senses are in overdrive, and all he can hear is a ringing sound. He bashes his hands into his head, and finally it starts to go away. Jack almost feels calm, and he rigidly adjusts his posture and marches up the stairs. Clancy is lounging in his dark cell when the first light in days shine over his cross face. It's Jack. He's opened the door, and he sits down on the floor next to his brother. They sit side by side in silence for a few beats before Clancy giggles and turns to Jack, coarsely asking if he wants to fuck. Jack stares at him blankly for a couple of seconds, and then, in a detached voice, answers back, "Sure." And so the story ends with the two of them looking into the camera like half-wits, as if this were a fucking sitcom or some shit. And that's literally it. That's the end. Sorry, but before we go to the next arc, I have to stop and point out this panel here, because I think it's really demonstrative of the whole entire story. Do you notice how much more detailed the drawing on the left is over the right? Notice how much higher resolution it is? Do you notice how the figure on the right is so obviously copy and pasted from another scene entirely onto here? Holy fucking shit, man. God damn it, bro. You couldn't make this shit up, dog. And so now we're on to the next one. Like I said, still written by Max Bemis, but with art this time by Erramouspe and Mauro Vargas. Yeah, this one will seem to be a complete 180 pivot from whatever the last story was trying to be. Yeah, we pivot to trying to do political social commentary. So, yay. I can't wait for literally everyone to get pissed off about this one. Right, so the story opens on the third planet from the sun. You might have heard of it. Anyway, the framing here is setting up the contrast between the slow, millennia-long development of human society, from animals to sophisticates. It's contrasting that against the simple savagery of the crossed. It's easier to knock down than to build, in other words. And there's no lower fall for humanity than its descent into the world of the crossed. And look, there's a group of them now, spit roasting each other, I guess, on the streets of a destroyed city, right in front of a building, cleverly named Comic Store. I wonder if they specialize in tax forms. Anyway, take a long, hard look at our infected friends here, cause this is basically the last time any of them show up for the rest of the story. At least, not in a flashback. Whatever the case, we enter the comic store and meet 4 comic nerds who have been trapped inside the shop for the last year. Yeah, I'm serious. I'm just gonna give them my own names as we go along, based on their appearances, cause honestly, there's not much else that separates them as characters. Anywho, right now, the crew is doing one of their ritual complaining sessions. The one with the Wolverine facial hair laments that, thanks to the apocalypse, now they'll never know how their favorite comics would have ended. And next, the schlubby one I call Donut. He remembers how he used to be considered a freak for being in his 30s and still liking superheroes. But Donut argues that the normies just didn't understand what the soups meant to him. He loved superheroes because whenever he felt insecure or judged, he identified with them in order to feel better about himself and assert his own superiority. Yo, Max Bemis, didn't you write Moon Knight? What are you doing right now, buddy? In any case, another guy, who looks like the bad guy in Ghostbusters 2, he tells Donut that these days he doesn't give a shit about superheroes saving puppies or punching aliens or whatever. No. He wishes he had a comic about a hero confronting the crossed-shaped world outside their windows. Wolvie takes this all in, and he's like, "Bruh, you're a genius." So he walks over to a room in the back and uses the key to unlock a heavy door. The room inside is almost pitch black, save for the few rays of light struggling to make it through the prison bar-like windows. And on the inside, a woman crouches, hunched over in the middle of the dirty room. Her name is Leia, and she's bluntly informed that they have a job for her. From there, we do a flashback to the precious final moments before the outbreak. We're in the same comic book store, and Leia's there too, but back when she was actually well put together and happy. She's a self-published indie comic book author, doing a signing with a line that goes out the store and wraps around the building. Heh. Somehow, that's the least believable thing in the entire book, am I right, guys? Anyway, it turns out Wolvie, Donut, and Buster worked at the shop, and they were very displeased that Leia was there. Wolvie goes on a long rant that's aged so poorly on all angles, I'm not even sure how to tackle it. Basically try to think back to the discourse and politics of the Gamergate era from like a decade ago. Right, the dudes here are supposed to be caricatures of the comic book readers Max Bemis opposed. So they hate Leia because she's a feminazi, and they're mad that women in comics and video games are no longer sexy. But it's also funny because Bemis also has the dudes call the other side, his side mind you, basically hyper-emotional Harry Potter millennials. Which, of course, contains a web of associations, that side of things, now in part disavows. It's a curious artifact. Language and coalitions, for and against each other, that neither side wants to own all these years later. But back to things people actually give a shit about. Outside, spontaneously, the crossed outbreak begins. A rash-bearing homicidal freak pops out of nowhere, lunging at people with a knife and ripping into them with ferocious strokes, and soon enough the streets begin to stain red. Wolvie observes all this out the window, and he screams at everyone to get the fuck out of his store immediately. He pushes the ignorant crowd outside, but one person, with a pink mohawk, manages to force their way back inside. Leia's still on the inside too, and as the madness spreads outside, Buster promises her that she's their responsibility, and they're gonna keep her safe. But cut back to the present, and those very same men are now pointing a gun at the girl, callously telling her to look alive. They alert Leia that if she does her job well, they'll ease up on her other obligations. And so Wolvie gets down in the woman's face and reveals their demands. The four of them want an original, ongoing monthly comic, something to give them hope in these trying times. Leia snorts and remarks that they're all more emotionally stunted than she thought. In any case, she points out that she didn't do superhero comics before, and she's probably not capable of the fan service they've come to expect from the genre. Pinky, the guy with the mohawk, crosses his arms and smirks, smugly taunting Leia that she should be used to fan service by now. Ignoring that remark, Wolvie coldly notifies the author that she only has a few days to create issue 1, and it better be good for her sake. And so we actually next find ourselves within the pages of Leia's comic. A comic within a comic, if you will. In it, a group of kids cry in terror as one of their own gets sexually violated by a horde of drooling crossed. The children all panic because they know they're next. Or are they? A figure lurks in the sky, draped in a large black cloak, and in the blink of an eye, this mysterious character drops hundreds of feet onto the ground. With a confident, booming voice, the stranger announces that they are the, quote, ritter of rape and the murderer of molestation. They then dramatically tear off their outer coat, revealing their true identity. The Anticrossed. A superhero who kind of looks like that one fruit roll-up you find under your couch one day. Anyway, he unsheathes 2 sharp claws and effortlessly slices through the crossed like bugs. Anticrossed even licks their nasty blood off his blade, but he doesn't become infected. He's immune. The kids all thank their hero, and he pats them on the head and leaves, flying away to another adventure. Man, this must be what it's like for that one guy who narrates Sonichu comics. Whatever. Anyway, the 4 sluggards actually love the comic. It's kind of literally the best thing they've ever read, I guess. So they all clamor for more. 1 week later, Leia is finally granted kitchen privileges after she agrees to go weekly. And 3 weeks later, the momentum is steady, and the stories are epic. Anticrossed even teams up with Ash. And Leia gets more and more rights in accordance with her output. 3 months after the debut of the first issue, the guys are even talking crossover event books with tie-ins. Leia asks what's in it for her, and they all come to an agreement that no one is to touch her anymore, as long as she's writing for them. And she also gets her own comics to read. We next jump ahead to a damn near 6 months later since the onset of the book. A red truck cruises through the run-down, decaying streets. The occupants? A gay couple. The one on the left is much more flamboyant, and the one on the right is stern-looking and serious. Apparently, they have been aimlessly driving around for months, despite the fact that Crossed are obviously drawn to loud car noises. But what is even more confounding is that they candidly acknowledge that they have left a perfectly safe location, only to go on a road trip, visiting abandoned movie theaters. Yeah, I don't know how to spin this one. Moving along. Practically off-panel, some Crossed goons chuck a baby at their windshield. They don't really react, though. Instead, Blue Boy here excitedly turns to their partner, sharing how much they miss the smell of a comic book store? Huh? Meanwhile, in the store, Wolvie bursts into Leia's makeshift office, demanding to know why she's 2 days past her deadline. She basically calls him a limp dick and tells him to go fuck himself. But something snaps in the guy, and he escalates, and in retaliation, he pulls out the gun and orders the girl to get on her knees. Leia protests that they had an agreement, but it's fruitless, and nonetheless, the man forces himself onto her. After it's over, Leia finally exhales all the breath she was holding, bellowing out in an angry, wounded roar. She defiantly tosses the 4 men their latest comic, and as it turns out, the newest Anticrossed book takes things in a bit of a different direction. It opens with a scruffy-looking Crossed guy tweaking out about to rape a crying woman, but then the Anticrossed shows up, ripping into the roughneck. He calls him a pathetic, disgusting creep, desperate to prove his manhood, even though no woman would ever want him. And then AC just decapitates the guy. Wolvie froths with rage, asking what the fuck this shit is. He pins Leia against the wall, reminding her that he's got a gun. Leia narrows her eyes and replies that she knows. It's weird, small, and stubby. Wolvie screams at her to shut up and get back to work. He warns her that the next issue better be a return to form, or else he'll shoot her in the head and play with her body. But the argument is cut off there, as the 2 of them hear the sound of a running vehicle pulling in outside the building. It's Blue and the Stoic, who get out of their car, confident that it can't be any more crazier in there than it is outside. We next do a little flashback sequence of Leia's career trajectory. Her short stint with big publishers, who thought she didn't get the market and didn't like what she was doing with their characters. Her attempt to go Hollywood, but her resignation over executive interference and creative tampering, which ultimately led her to self-publishing, which meant she would never be under the overbearing whim of another ever again. But back to the present. Wolvie, Donut, and Buster welcome the visitors to their crusty-ass comic shop, and Blue is like a kid in a candy store, running his fingers through all of the floppies. He pulls out an Avatar Press Garth Ennis book and winces when he looks at the contents. A little bit messed up, I guess. The comic guys inquire where they're coming from, and Stoic explains that they were completely safe and secure, but Blue got bored and wanted to find other people. I'm not fucking joking, that's what it says. Buster asks how long they've known each other exactly. Stoic hesitates, but Blue loudly declares that they've been together for 8 years. Wolvie's like, cool, and asks if they want dinner. And meanwhile, Pinky is informing Leia of the situation. He tells her if she tries to make any calls for help, they'll put a bullet in her, and probably kill the guests too. But Pinky's voice trails off there, and in a soft mumble, he tells her that he never got a chance to tell her this, but he's always secretly liked her comics. He wishes that they could have let her go and never let it come to this. Leia tenses in anger and spits back at him that he should have thought about that before he participated in her abuses as well. And so they all have dinner, and it turns out that Blue actually knew Leia's work and was a big fan, and he gushes over it with her. Donut tries to make conversation by asking what being gay is like, and asks how they can live without honking a titty every now and then. Stoic, with a guarded, expressionless face, curtly replies that it's exactly the same as being straight, except when they're fucking dudes. There's an awkward silence, and everyone just quickly shovels food in their mouths with their heads down. Anyway, after dinner, things have cooled off, and Wolvie announces to the visitors that Leia's been working on a comic for them. Blue's like, OMG, I need to see this. But Leia's hesitant, pleading that it's not polished and he wouldn't want to read it. Wolvie then covertly presses his gun into her back, and in a thinly threatening, fake-friendly voice, he tells her to stop being silly and go grab the latest issue she was working on to show everyone. So the girl retrieves it, and, trembling, hands it to Blue before meekly slinking off back into her office. Blue thanks her and enthusiastically digs in. He flies through the book, laughing and cycling through, looking down at the pages and up at the shop owners. Wolvie begs to know what's so funny, and Blue asks him if he's read it yet. Wolvie, concerned, answers no, and then he aggressively snatches it out from the man's hands, and his eyes bulge out of his head as he views the panels before him. The issue opens with Anticrossed visiting the comic store on a routine patrol for infected folk to kill. Instead, he finds 3 of the nerds circle-jerking each other on the floor. The comic Wolvie jumps up and shakes his hero's hand, offering him a chance to take a turn with the girl they have locked up in the back, who is, of course, Leia. Wolvie brags that they could never bag a chick like this in real life, but now, during the apocalypse, they can do whatever they want, whenever they want. In any case, the 3 of them get on their knees, worshipping Anticrossed. Wolvie kisses his feet and praises him for being the perfect male role model, and for saving them from feminists and non-submissive women. Anticrossed lets out a hefty laugh, and responds that that's pretty funny, that they would call him an ideal man, considering he never was born one. And so AC pulls a dildo out of their drawers, and they start beating the fuck out of Wolvie with it. It's a bloody mess, and the Anticrossed and Leia high-five each other and celebrate. I think I'm gonna need a minute to process this one. Regardless, Wolvie is pissed the fuck off, and he clenches his teeth in rage. Blue tells him to calm down, it was just a joke after all, but then the guy points his gun at the guests, and commands Donut to go retrieve the author. Donut rushes as fast as his meaty legs will take him back to Leia's cell, but when he pushes open the door, he can't find her anywhere. He looks around wildly, and a figure watches from behind the shadows of the door. And then, pouncing like a cat, Leia pops out and jams several pens into Donut's neck. He gurgles, choking on his own blood, before ultimately collapsing onto the floor. Wolvie screams at him in vain from the other room to hurry the fuck up, and Buster cheers that it's time to put a quote-unquote lead tampon up that hormonal bitch. Pinky, for his part, whispers to Blue and Stoic that the others have lost their minds and he doesn't know what to do. Blue tells him to cause a distraction, so Pinky rushes at Buster and attempts to put him in a headlock. Wolvie roars in anger and starts blasting at Pinky. However, he only manages to hit and kill Buster. The maniac yells at everyone to freeze, and so Wolvie announces that he's leaving this shithole, and they're gonna stand there and not move an inch while he does so. But, as it would happen, fate has different plans in store. Breathing heavy, Leia steps into the room and slams a heavy staple gun directly into Wolvie's face. He cries out in pain, clutching his aching head, but Leia quickly follows it up with another strike, and Blue tackles him to the ground. But this is Leia's kill, and she completely lets loose, and savagely bashes the abuser's face in with the tool, mangling it with a collection of staples. It's pretty gnarly, but it's a shame that it's overlaid with them shouting about social justice warriors in 2025. Anyway, Pinky pops his head out of his hiding spot, happy that Leia made it, but she shoots him in the skull for all the shit he did to her in the past. And just like that, it's finally over. Leia stands there silently, before telling Blue and Stoic that it's probably time for them to go now. But as Blue walks out the door, he turns back and tells Leia that she's his hero. And so the story ends with the author smoking a cigarette in the middle of the store, before tossing it on a pile of comics, igniting a fire that will burn out the place of its wretchedness. And thus, so concludes the tale.
Kowalski, analysis.
So, that was Crossed by Max Bemis. What are your guys' thoughts? Shrink or Anti-Crossed? Which one would you rank higher? Or worse? Make sure to share all your thoughts in the comment section. This is a group therapy session, so get it all out. But until then, I guess I'll do my promised autopsy of what exactly went wrong here. Before we start, I'll let you know that I'm about to get a little real here, and the point is not to be mean. Max Bemis, if by some chance you watch this, this just wasn't a good showing, man, okay? It's okay. It happens sometimes. It's alright. Okay. So I'll begin first by talking about Shrink, alone by itself. If I had to sum it up in a word, I would use squandered. The idea, at its core, is actually pretty good, and it had a lot of potential. I mean, like someone trying to psychologically analyze the Crossed, that is. In previous stories, they've been studied scientifically, in regard to the virus and its spread, but also they've occasionally been philosophically treated as well, looking at the why they're here. But we never really focused on what the Crossed are beyond behavioral description, so the idea of capturing one and asking it questions is kind of cool. Not that you would expect to cure them, but rather to understand them better, like the extent to which their minds are imprints of what they used to be. Are they basically parrots? Just saying shit with no real understanding, based off of whatever the virus is pulling out of their brain that it's like piloting. But all of that's just one aspect of it. The brother angle could have been good too. You know, him crumbling apart like the telltale heart for what he did to his brother and all. And of course, there's always the trope of the psychologist becoming the subject themselves. But clearly none of that really happened. At least compellingly. I think the Shrink story was originally just meant to be a throwaway comedic story, but it kind of ended up coming off as a little schizophrenic with the tonal whiplash. It flirted with the idea of developing Tiffany's character, for instance, and giving her depth, but it obviously got completely undermined with that masturbation scene. And all that could be the joke, but it just doesn't make that much sense. And that's just one example. And honestly, and this is like my big thing, my big thesis here. I have this theory of mind for Max Bemis, and it's that he felt insecure about the unserious nature of the first arc here. Basically, I think this guy wants to be seen a certain way, and producing an empty entertainment cross story doesn't comport with that, and I reckon it made him feel uncomfortable. So I think he half-heartedly tried to encode some sense of meaning or arc into Shrink, but because it still ends the same ridiculous way, it becomes even more nihilistic and meaningless. Because, you know, you kind of set up things and prime readers for there to be a point, and then you just fucking dab on them in ways that don't make sense in relation to the character motivations or behavior you just set up. But, yeah. Even beyond that, though, Shrink is just amateurly written and constructed. Scenes and flashbacks make no sense where they are in the story, or even generally at all. I've largely hammered into that while we were going through it, so... But, I mean, you get it. Anyway, so this takes us to transitioning over to the next arc. Anticrossed. And at first glance, it would seem almost unbelievable that this same guy would write meaningless drivel, immediately followed up by preachy social commentary back to back. But I think it actually makes sense, right? Because remember my theory of mind. I suspect this guy has this anchoring self-image of himself, which really always means the way you want others to see you. So I think this author sees himself as a guy who has something to say. So psychologically, he cannot stand the dissonance of writing a lowbrow book. I mean, he probably only justified submitting Shrink by soothing himself with the notion that this next arc would be the super serious one. But of course, nobody asked him to do that or held him to that standard but himself. And that's how we end up doing a complete 180 and end up with a massive overcorrection. So, yeah. Let's talk about Anticrossed. It's the paragon of the word contrived, the epitome of missing the assignment. Obviously not a cross story. They're not even fucking in it, but the comic also makes zero sense and simply cannot take place within the crossed universe. We have 4 of the least plausible survivors living in a comic shop for a year and a half, and then we have motherfuckers going on field trips during the apocalypse to the city like it's Comic-Con or some shit. I mean, this is crossed, right? Do I need to explain why this, on its face, doesn't work? And that's because it's contrived. Bemis needed the characters to be dysgenic comic nerds because he wanted to write an ideological screed against toxic comic readers, even if it doesn't make any sense. But that's the beauty of it, really. Why Anticrossed failed so hard is not actually because of the contents of its political messaging or the inherent inclusion attempt to introduce politics to the series. No. In truth, It was a spectacular failure, solely due to the incompetent execution. All right. Max Bemis, buddy, I'm about to give you some advice in rhetoric, okay? I'm going to tell you why you failed at making a point or convincing literally anyone, and why you actually probably actively harmed your own positioning here. To start, from the outset, you basically go, yeah, the people who disagree with me on social issues would totally be rapists in an apocalypse. All right, you immediately lost anyone who didn't already agree with you there, okay? You're now solely preaching to the choir of those who agreed with your views coming in, okay? Which, to me, largely seems to be a pointless exercise. You just basically have a bunch of people standing around in a circle saying the same thing. It's performative, and it doesn't induce change or movement. I mean, maybe you feel better about yourself, but then it's just social signaling. But leaving all that aside, we don't have to touch on that. This is the part where you fucked up, man. Like I said, your only readers at this point are those who already agreed. However, you bungled this shit so bad, you literally split the audience and forced half of them to disavow your book anyway. Right, because the readers are also crossed fans. And this is an abysmally bad cross story, for the reasons I already laid out. So at least half of your sympathizers cringe and feel lectured by this substandard story, lacking in any nuance or sophistication, or really that much entertainment value. You can have your messaging, you just need to have a good cross story. But it didn't happen. And meanwhile, the other half, the most partisan readers, they're the only ones falling over themselves, trying to convince anyone it's good or profound. But they twist so hard trying to explain away the structural nonsense that they lose all credibility and undermine themselves doing so. And that's on you, Bemis. You force people who agree with you to compromise themselves, defending patently low-quality storytelling. At the end of the day, there's no getting around that this was all a disaster. I hate to be a negative Nelly. I'm sure the author has better stuff out there, and this is certainly not a permanent or irreconcilable mark on his character or abilities. Just a cautionary tale. If you have to subordinate logic and coherence to make a point, you've already lost. That about does it for today's video. If you made it this far, I would like to thank you immensely for sticking around till the end. I'm about to do a big move, so I'll be in a different location next time. For that reason, the next video might not be out for a little bit, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll be back as better and stronger as ever. I love you guys. But until next time, I will thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good one.